He took a bite of the prune cake, and the deep, rich flavors of cinnamon and allspice melted on his tongue. The prunes were his favorite, sweet, soft, and familiar. Moist crumbs stuck to the roof of his mouth as he reached for the coffee she'd poured. It was steaming, strong, comforting. It was the last thing he ever tasted. The last thing he ever saw was her cold eyes watching him with a faint, satisfied smile. This is the story of Nannie Doss, the Giggling Granny, a serial killer who poisoned 4 of her 5 husbands from 1920 to 1954. You're listening to True Crime Culinary. I'm your host, Leah Llach. Let's sink our teeth into this story. First, we're going to talk about Nannie Doss's early life. Nannie Doss was born Nancy Agnes Hazel in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama. She didn't have an easy start. Her father was strict and abusive, and her mother was neglectful, basically turning a blind eye to the father's abuse. The children were kept at home from school, and they were forced to do chores on the farm in place of school. At 7, Nannie Doss was on a train, and the train stopped very suddenly, so she was catapulted forward and hit her head on a bar. You may have heard the phrase traumatic brain injury. That's kind of what we call it when something really bad happens to the brain from some sort of injury, and the fallout of that can be things like what Nannie Doss experienced. But at the time, it was really hard to pinpoint. She also didn't come from a wealthy family, so she wouldn't have had the resources to go to the doctor and get a bunch of expensive x-rays. So, basically she was in a really tough spot. So what did Nannie Doss do? She basically escaped through romances. She escaped through romance magazines, pages filled with love, freedom, and the kind of safety she never felt at home. At 16, she found a loophole in her father's tyranny, which was to escape through marriage. She wed her first husband, Charlie Braggs, after only 4 months of dating, and they had 4 children over 6 years. But living with Charlie's mother was really hard and very triggering because Charlie's mother was controlling and cruel and made Nannie feel trapped again. And this is something that we kind of think kind of contributed to her kind of falling off the rails, because not everybody who has a traumatic childhood is going to become a serial killer, but something definitely shifted for her and made her into a very cruel, heartless person, really focused on her own gain. And it's likely that this is right around the time when she kind of just was pushed over the edge. Because within a year of living with Charlie's mother, 2 of her children died from quote unquote food poisoning. And then Charlie soon left. I remember reading that he was just really creeped out. And so they divorced and they split up the surviving children. So now Nannie Doss is divorced. She's got 1 kid with her and she's got her eyes set on her next romance. So she marries Robert Harrelson. He was charming at first, but he also turned out to be an abusive alcoholic. And after 16 years of marriage, one too many assaults pushed Nannie over the edge. She poured arsenic into his moonshine and he was dead within a week. The insurance payout bought her a nice piece of land. So for her, this is kind of looking like something very positive. She does something, she takes control, she gets what she wants. Then came Arlie Lanning, whom she met through a Lonely Hearts column. When he died, people assumed it was alcoholism. She played the grieving widow and kind of picked up more insurance money. Richard Morton was husband number 4, not a drinker, but wicked unfaithful. She poisoned him too, and his mother for good measure. Then we get to Samuel Doss. This is the one who maybe should have seen it coming, but at the time we didn't have the same Facebook profile, check with friends, easy lookups. It was way more based on word of mouth. It was much easier to get away with things because you could basically just make it difficult to find. Although he was careful, quiet, and a man who kept to order and routine, something happened where she just felt like she needed to change something. And unfortunately, it was to kill him. So she made a prune cake and had poison within it, but he survived. He got to the doctor. The doctors watched him, I think, for a month. He was able to recover. And unfortunately, they didn't spot the fact that it was likely from Nannie Doss. So when he got home, unfortunately, she had a cup of coffee with more arsenic in it. He drank it and he died. So at this point, the doctor's like, this is way too suspicious. This is way too convenient that he goes back home and gets poisoned again. I'm going to ask for an autopsy. What is mind-blowing to me and yet fits in with this kind of like narcissistic, I'm too smart, no one's going to figure me out mentality is Nannie Doss said, okay, she approved the autopsy. And the doctor opened up Samuel Doss, discovered a truckload of arsenic, and that was what was used to indict her and basically say, like, she shouldn't be allowed to be on the streets anymore. So, spoiler alert, she did go to prison and she died 10 years later of leukemia. Now, in my research for Nannie Doss, I did stumble across a few resources that were super interesting, and I want to share some highlights with you. She earned the name the Giggling Granny for her unnerving habit of smiling and laughing while talking about her crimes. This is likely some sort of coping mechanism or something to do with her traumatic brain injury. The idea that you could be talking about death and poisoning and also be smiling and giggling is just like not normal behavior. So we're going to assume that there was something not right there with the neurons firing. However, I saw pictures and video, and it is so unnerving to see her. I want you to imagine a sweet grandmotherly face, but her eyes are stone cold. And she would say things like, they claim I killed my husband, which really speaks to somebody who's trying to separate themselves from their actual deed, right? She doesn't say, I killed my husband, or I've been accused of killing my husband. She's saying those people over there, claim I killed my husband, which is just like she's with words trying to separate herself from the situation. I also watched a video. I'll link the name of the show in the show notes. It was super interesting, and they basically analyzed her body language. And I saw a video of her being interviewed, and I want you to imagine like Nannie Doss is sitting kitty corner to an investigator. So her body is facing basically away from him, watching him out of the corner of her eyes. The best thing I can describe is it's like looking at a tiger. I don't know how to, it just like screams carnivore to me, like some sort of predator, because she's in so much control of her body. She's not even aligning and pointing at him. She's just stiff, but it's like she's ready to pounce. And yet she's trying to give the facade that she's very calm. So this is a very practiced skill that she has. And the eye thing is just, it is truly unnerving to see her. Like I said, I'll put the link in the show notes because it's very interesting. And breaking down her body language just tells you that this is somebody who does not have empathy, is very controlled, wants to control everything around her, and knows that she can put off their persona of like this loving grandmother. She can lull people into a sense of calm, and that is when she can strike. But why did she kill? Well, I'd like to point out that she suffered from a lot of abuse, neglect, and a head injury. But also, she wanted control, and she couldn't control her father. She couldn't control her life or her circumstances early on, but she could get a hold of poison. Her overall motivation for the killing, though, wasn't just to be in control. It was actually to find love, and she just was looking for this perfect love. But I think, unfortunately, because all that was modeled to her in the world of love was kind of this like very bizarre spectrum of, on one hand, abuse, almost torturous behavior. On the other hand, these like fantasy romance novels. And she's trying to bring those two together because she doesn't know how to find something more normal. And that's where she was kind of like, I'll just use poison, wipe this one out, and go find a new one. But let's find the culinary connection. The prune cake. I read that and I was like, why prunes? Because prunes, I know, are sweet, but I was like, why wouldn't you put it in a chocolate cake? I don't know. I love chocolate, so that was my first thought. It's not just about convenience, it's also about economics. So in post-World War II America, ingredients like sugar, butter, and eggs were still super expensive. But prunes were cheap, sweet, and easy to find. In 1953, a dollar could buy about 3.4 pounds of prunes, but it could barely buy 1.5 pounds of chocolate. So it's just way more economical to buy prunes. Way more bang for your buck. Because of the economy of prunes, prune cake became a Southern classic between the 1930s and the 1960s, especially during rationing. The dried fruit added moisture and sweetness when bakers had to skimp on fat and sugar. But what about the main ingredient Nannie Doss put into the prune cake? Arsenic. Well, arsenic is actually very common on farms. Remember, she grew up on a farm Farms tend to have rodents. And how do you control rodents? I mean, ideally you have like a barn cat or something, like a lot of owls to kind of help you. But some people have to resort to arsenic. Again, do not recommend, because then you put it into the food chain. But probably at the time it was something she could easily get her hands on, she was familiar with, and she probably knew that it didn't smell like anything and it didn't taste like anything. So there she is thinking, what do I have in my disposal? What can I actually control? Arsenic. So I think Nannie Doss, real piece of work. However, I do think it's interesting to kind of look at her decisions and figure out why she did what she did. We will never know for certain, but we can surmise through observations of her body language, information about her childhood, understanding the types of decisions she made to take control of her life, that she probably used food to get close to people because it was the one thing that never got questioned. So in a real Game of Thrones type of move, Nannie Doss found the one way that she could take control of her life, and that was to use food to poison people around her. Food, after all, is trust made edible, and she weaponized that. That is the story of Nannie Doss, the Giggling Granny. Poison prune cake and a smile that never reached her eyes, Nannie Doss reminds us how comfort and care can hide something dangerous underneath. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen. If you want to follow me outside of the podcast, check me out on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube at But First Bread, where I share clips from the podcast, recipes you can cook safely at home, and plenty of food and fashion fun. Until next time.